Sometimes the most confusing seasons of your life arrive without warning. No collapse, no drama, just a quiet that feels too empty to trust. And the mind whispers, something must be wrong. But what if this silence is not a problem to solve, but a doorway your awareness has never learned to recognize? The most unsettling experiences are not born from chaos, but from the moments when life grows strangely unresponsive. No resistance to push against, no signs to interpret, just a subtle distance as if reality has turned its face away. And in that distance, discomfort deepens. Because when everything is loud, the mind knows how to struggle. But when nothing answers back, it has nothing to grasp, no friction to prove that it still exists in motion. This is where many people quietly decide they are stuck. They look around and see no progress. Conversations feel hollow. Plans carry no spark. Even practices meant to reconnect with the unseen begin to feel weightless, as if the universe has gone cold to their voice. Yet this phase is not absence, it is preparation. Before a deep shift can take shape, excess movement fades. In complex systems, transformation is not born from constant stimulation. It arrives after compression, after tension softens, after the noise of scattered impulses dissolves into a single direction. When feedback disappears, it is not because nothing is happening. It is because reality is no longer responding to fragmented signals. It is gathering itself, and gathering requires stillness. The human mind is rarely taught to trust this. We learn to read motion as proof of progress. We learn to treat noise as evidence of life. So when the outer world stops reflecting our expectations back to us, the mind fills the space with fear. It names the quiet as delay, punishment, or misalignment. But those labels come from habit, not from how change actually unfolds. What you are sensing is not emptiness, it is refinement. When the field grows quiet, your inner signal is no longer being pulled in too many directions. Old wants lose their urgency, old fears loosen their grip. The reflex to react begins to fade, and that fading feels unfamiliar, because reaction once felt like proof that you were becoming something. But reaction is not alignment. Alignment is coherence, and coherence is quiet. When interference drops, the signal becomes clear. Urgency, constant expectation, and the need for reassurance all fracture the connection. As they dissolve, the field does not rush to display results. It stabilizes within first. This is why silence often comes before movement. Many people misread this moment and undo it. When the outer world grows still, the mind searches for noise. It hunts for signs. It reopens old stories. It reaches for stimulation, not because anything is broken, but because silence threatens the identity that survived through constant engagement. Yet this quiet is deeply active. When the nervous system exits survival patterns, its output softens. Fewer urgent thoughts, less emotional turbulence. To an untrained awareness, this can feel like something is missing. But nothing is missing. Integration has begun. You cannot move into a new trajectory from a state of alarm. That is why transformation does not announce itself loudly. It clears excess signals. It gently loosens your emotional grip on outcomes that no longer belong to your path. In this detachment, fear can arise. Calm can be mistaken for losing direction, but direction is not born from noise. It emerges from inner coherence. If you are in this phase, you may notice a quiet shift within. The hunger for answers softens, not because everything is solved, but because the urgency has dissolved. What once provoked you no longer pulls as strongly. The need to force outcomes begins to fade. And if your identity was built on striving, this calm can feel like standing on unfamiliar ground. Yet this is often the moment before resolution. The field grows silent, not to withdraw from you, but to remove interference. It stops asking for your reaction because alignment is happening beneath the surface. Without friction, without emotional charge, without inner contradiction. This silence is not calling you to act. It is asking you to not interrupt what is settling into place. Because when the signal clears fully, change does not arrive in small, polite steps. It reorganizes the structure of your experience. No system reshapes itself while being constantly touched, tested, and pulled in different directions. The more disturbance there is, the less precise the outcome becomes. This is not a poetic idea. It is how complex patterns behave when they are overloaded with pressure and input. Noise keeps everything in motion, but motion without clarity prevents form from taking shape. Before probabilities crystallize into a new configuration, interaction decreases, feedback thins out, external cues grow faint, not because nothing is happening, but because scattered movement is giving way to inner coherence. When too many signals compete, outcomes remain undecided. When the signal stabilizes, direction becomes inevitable. This is why silence arrives before visible change. Observation itself alters behavior. The more aggressively a system is watched and emotionally charged with expectation, the more unstable its response becomes. When attention carries urgency, doubt, or pressure, it disrupts the settling process. So as your inner state grows quieter, less reactive, less fragmented, the outer field reflects that reduction. Feedback softens, signals fade, not as rejection, but as synchronization. This is where misunderstanding often arises. Many believe progress must be constantly confirmed, that signs are required to keep movement alive. But validation is interaction, and interaction delays resolution. Every time you check to see if it is working, you reintroduce uncertainty. Every time you question the process, the signal splits. And when the signal is split, outcomes remain open, suspended, undecided. Silence arrives when your input is no longer needed. At this stage, your internal state becomes the dominant signal. Thought, emotion, and identity begin to move in the same direction without effort. You are no longer pulling toward one future while bracing for another. You are no longer desiring change while gripping what is familiar. That internal agreement reduces the need for constant external adjustment. The field draws inward before it reshapes outward. This pattern repeats across all complex systems. Energy gathers before release. Neural pathways synchronize before learning stabilizes. Living structures pause before differentiation. Silence is not inactivity. It is the reduction of interference so form can emerge. Your life is following the same rhythm. When feedback disappears, it is because you are no longer asking the environment to regulate you moment by moment. Stability is becoming internal. And when stability moves inside, the field stops correcting from the outside. It waits, not passively, but with precision. This is why the mind resists this phase. The mind was shaped to predict through feedback. When feedback fades, prediction fails. And when prediction fails, the body assumes threat. Yet nothing dangerous is present. Only unfamiliar regulation. The nervous system is learning to remain steady without reassurance. The field does not respond to urgency. It does not respond to emotional pressure. It responds to coherence. And coherence does not announce itself loudly. It expresses as neutrality, as steadiness, as the absence of compulsive reaction. So when signs stop appearing, it is not because alignment is lost. It is because alignment no longer wavers enough to require constant adjustment. The field grows quiet when it is preparing to move with clarity, not because you failed, but because you stopped interfering. The discomfort you feel is not evidence that something is wrong. It is the sensation of a system that was trained to survive through stimulation, learning to rest without it. For most of your life, movement meant relevance. Noise meant control. Problems, urgency, and goals provided orientation. When that familiar structure falls away, the body does not immediately recognize peace. It registers uncertainty. And uncertainty feels threatening to a system designed to predict. When external feedback withdraws, the world stops confirming who you are, what matters, and what comes next. The cues the nervous system once used to stabilize itself are no longer present, and in that absence, discomfort arises. Not because you are unsafe, but because the system no longer knows how to orient itself through the old maps it once depended on. This is why the quiet phase can feel tense inside, even when nothing appears to be happening outside. From a neurobiological perspective, this moment sits between two modes of regulation. The brain has not yet fully settled into a state of deep calm, but it is no longer running on chronic survival patterns either. You are between rhythms, and in between rhythms, the nervous system becomes highly sensitive. searching for signals that are no longer there. The instinctive response is to recreate stimulation. Sudden urges arise, the impulse to check, to reach out, to reopen old conversations, to stir emotion just to feel something familiar again. These impulses are not guidance. They are reflex. The body is trying to restore a known pattern, not lead you forward into something new. Here is the distinction that changes everything. Regulation does not come from stimulation, it comes from stability. This quiet phase is teaching your nervous system to remain coherent without external confirmation, to feel grounded without reaction, to experience presence without leaning into anticipation. This cannot be forced by intellect. It unfolds through allowance, not control. This is where many people misinterpret the experience. They assume that if something were aligned, it would feel immediately comfortable. But transformation at the level of identity does not always feel pleasant. It feels unfamiliar. The nervous system is recalibrating to a higher baseline, one that no longer depends on urgency, emotional spikes, or constant motion to feel alive. Recalibration feels disorienting before it feels natural. When the system can remain steady without needing the environment to move, something stabilizes within. Attention becomes less scattered. Thought becomes less compulsive. Emotion becomes less reactive. That internal coherence communicates readiness to the field more clearly than any deliberate method ever could. This phase is not about doing less. It is about reacting less. You are not asked to suppress impulses. You are asked to notice them without obeying them. Each time you choose not to reintroduce noise, the nervous system learns a new pattern. Safety without stimulation. This pattern is essential for sustaining a new trajectory once it arrives, because without this capacity, any expansion will trigger contraction. This is also why a subtle, undefined fear can surface here. Not fear of a specific outcome, but a quiet sense that something is shifting. That sensation is not prophetic, it is physiological. The nervous system detects change without a familiar script to follow. Instead of escaping this sensation, this phase invites you to remain with it without labeling it as a problem. The silence is not asking you to manufacture calm. It is asking you to stop feeding the old rhythm. As the body adapts to this quieter coherence, the discomfort fades. Not because the silence disappears, but because resistance to it dissolves. And when resistance dissolves, the field no longer needs to withhold response. This is when movement resumes. Not gradually, not theatrically, but precisely. When the field grows quiet, there is a narrow window where everything depends on what you do not do next. Not because you are being tested, but because your internal state is being stabilized. This is the moment when the system is most impressionable, not fragile, but receptive. This is also the moment when many people unknowingly interrupt the shift already underway. The interruption rarely feels like a decision. It arrives as a reflex, a subtle urge to re-engage, to provoke motion, to chase a feeling, an answer, a sign, or a reaction. The mind interprets silence as absence and absence as loss of control, so it reaches back toward familiarity. Old patterns, old worries, old emotional loops, not because they are true, but because they restore a sense of orientation. This is where trajectories diverge. From the field's perspective, silence indicates that interference has dropped. From the mind's perspective, silence feels like a loss of agency. And when control feels threatened, behavior reverts. The system looks for something to grip, something to react to, something that confirms who it believes itself to be. The fastest way to restore identity is to reintroduce emotional charge. But emotional charge is noise. The field does not respond to urgency, it responds to coherence. When urgency returns, even subtly, the signal becomes mixed again, not broken, but unstable. And instability delays resolution, not as punishment, but as precision. This is why forcing action during this phase feels strangely ineffective. Effort does not carry you forward here. It disperses focus, and dispersion keeps possibilities open instead of allowing them to settle. What feels like progress is often the very movement that delays resolution. The discipline in this space is not suppression. It is not passivity. It is restraint. The ability to remain present without reaching for closure. When you do not interrupt the quiet, the nervous system completes its recalibration. The old identity loosens its final grip, and the internal signal becomes unified. Not because you concentrated harder, but because you stopped dividing yourself between desire and fear. In this moment, a simple inner statement can support coherence, not as affirmation, not as belief, but as alignment, a gentle recognition of steadiness within. Not to make anything happen, but to reinforce the choice to remain grounded rather than reactive. It is a quiet agreement with what is already organizing itself. Silence does not ask for effort, it asks for consistency, and consistency allows the next phase to arrive without resistance. This quiet interval was never meant to stretch endlessly, not because it is delicate, but because once coherence stabilizes, movement becomes inevitable. No system can remain suspended forever. When inner signals align and probability compresses, resolution follows on its own. The silence remains only long enough to dissolve interference. When that work is complete, reality rearranges itself swiftly. That is why this passage often feels brief in hindsight. There is no ceremony, no clear line marking before and after. One day you are in stillness, and then suddenly you are not. Circumstances shift, opportunities surface, conversations change their tone, decisions become simple without effort. Because the transition was subtle, many people do not notice the crossing when it happens. They only recognize it later. Looking back, they sense that something ended quietly during that period, a way of thinking, a tolerance for certain dynamics, an attachment to struggle. The previous trajectory did not collapse with force, it lost relevance, and relevance is what keeps patterns alive. This is why so many say it happened without knowing how. When coherence reaches a critical threshold, the system resolves into the most stable configuration available. That resolution does not unfold according to linear time. It unfolds according to alignment. And once alignment is established, external change accelerates because resistance has already dissolved internally. The waiting was never outside of you, it was structural. Most people overlook this phase because it does not feel productive. There is nothing to manage, nothing to repair, nothing to optimize. Without tasks, the mind disengages. It labels the period as empty, uneventful, forgettable. But forgettable does not mean insignificant. It means it did not demand attention, and what does not demand attention often shapes the deepest change. This is also why trying to recreate this phase deliberately does not work. You cannot manufacture quiet, you cannot schedule coherence. It arrives as a consequence of inner fatigue. When the old identity no longer has the energy to hold itself together, the system naturally enters this compressed stillness. Not because you perform correctly, but because you stop sustaining what kept you divided. Once the shift completes, there is little impulse to explain it to anyone. There is no need to convince anyone. No impulse to announce what has changed. The new direction does not require confirmation. It simply begins to function. And that ordinariness can feel surprising because what once seemed impossible now feels quietly natural. This is why the quiet phase is so easy to overlook. It does not resemble transformation. It resembles emptiness. Yet it is within that apparent emptiness that old structures lose their hold and new patterns are able to settle into place. When emotional charge softens completely, possibility stops scattering. It gathers. And when it gathers, movement becomes effortless. Life begins to respond without friction, not because you pushed harder, but because nothing within you is resisting its direction. When the silence recedes, it does not announce itself. There is no dramatic shift to point at, no inner declaration that everything has changed. You notice it in subtler ways. Choices feel clearer. Certain openings appear without struggle. The path forward feels less negotiated, as if movement has found its own rhythm again. This is where many people misunderstand the moment. They assume the work is finished, that once the shift has occurred, stability will take care of itself. But stabilization is its own phase. The field reflects coherence, and coherence must be lived as life begins to move again. When momentum returns, the nervous system meets new terrain. Expansion brings unfamiliar responsibility. Growth introduces uncertainty of a different kind. Without inner steadiness, old patterns can quietly resurface, not as a full return, but as oscillation. clarity followed by doubt, forward steps followed by hesitation. Change does not ask for effort to begin. It asks for integrity to continue. This is where who you are matters more than what you intend. Identity is not sustained by inspiration. It is sustained by regulation, by emotional coherence, by a stable inner reference that does not depend on external conditions. The most delicate phase of transformation unfolds after the quiet, not before it. If the silence loosened the old identity, this next phase is where the new one learns to remain steady without rushing, without forcing, without falling back into familiar rhythms simply because life has become active again. The silence has already done its work. What remains is not to chase another shift, but to live from the steadiness that made the shift possible. To move without urgency, to respond without reverting to old reactions, to allow life to unfold without gripping it for reassurance. When coherence becomes natural, reality no longer needs to be asked.